Hi everyone, it's Professor Hull. Welcome back. So today we are going to be talking about plot. And essentially, plot is the action of our story. I'm recording this in a little bit of a different way, so I hope that it works. But at certain points, I'm going to be dragging an image over so that you can kind of see on a diagram what I'm talking about and referring to. The author of The Kite Runner, Khaled Hosseini, said, "Writing fiction is the act of weaving a series of lies to arrive at a greater truth." And I love this description of what a plot is. You're weaving together a series of lies to hopefully make it feel real for your reader, for your audience. Ray Bradbury, in his Zen in the Art of Writing, the famed science fiction writer Ray Bradbury said, "Plot is no more than footprints left in the snow, after your characters have run by on their way to incredible destinations. Plot is observed after the fact rather than before. It cannot precede action. It is the chart that remains when an action is through. That is all plot should ever be. It is human desire let run, running, and reach a goal. It cannot be mechanical. It can only be dynamic. So stand aside, forget the targets, let the characters, your fingers, body, blood, and heart do the work." I love that because I think that sometimes when writing plot, we want to go from A to B to C to D, and you have these points that you've kind of thought out in your mind, and you maybe have an outline written, and you just want to get to those points and hit those marks. And I like that he's saying, like, sometimes you need to let your characters just make the choices that they're going to make. I had a book that I thought was going to be quite different, and the characters didn't want to do what I wanted them to do, as crazy as that sounds. So yeah, the plot ended up being quite a bit different based on the choices that the characters were making. And when we talk about plot, the other thing I want to say before we get into kind of the mechanics of it is that some writers start with plot first, and they say, okay, here's what the events are, and then let's think about characters that could maybe react to these events or be part of these events. Other people start with a character first, and they have a little bit more of a character-driven plot. So, for example, a plot-driven novel made into several movies is Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park, the premise is that there are scientists who have been able to create dinosaurs using genetics and bioengineering technology. And then a very wealthy man sets up a park for wealthy tourists to be able to come and view and see dinosaurs and walk among them. And then everything goes horribly wrong, right? So in that, the premise is that the dinosaurs are on the loose and people are running away. That's a lot of the plot. People running away from the dinosaurs trying to survive. It is a very classic man versus nature kind of a plot, conflict. So it's a man versus nature conflict, and really any character that you drop into that situation, they're going to react maybe a little bit differently. The scientist versus the child versus the wealthy man running the park, they might react differently, but everybody's running away and trying to survive. That's the plot, right? So the plot drives the action forward. It drives forward the story. What's going to happen? A character-driven story is a tiny bit different. With a character-driven story, you have more of a what if and how would questions. So here's an example. You have, I'm using this term even though I don't love it, because this is the term that's used in this book, elderly spinster. So you have an elderly woman who has never been married. And how would that character react if there was a murder? Would the elderly spinster be having a panic attack and freaking out about the murder? Or would she be able to solve the murder because she's able to observe details based on her knowledge of the world from her 90 years of life? And that's the premise of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple series, that the pace of life has increased, that you have these younger people who are kind of romantic, and they look at the atmosphere rather, and they get tricked by various characters because they're young and naive, and she's older and wiser, and therefore she would observe things and not be falling into some of these same traps. If you take that same trope, or the same archetypal character. An archetype is a character that we've seen many times, right? So you take that same archetypal character of an elderly spinster, but you ask a different question, and you say, how would she act after being driven half mad by her lover's desertion on their wedding day decades ago? And how would she react if she's been thinking about this and stewing about it and obsessing about it for years and years? And if you answer that question, you get Great Expectations. Two totally different books, two totally different genres, both really based on the choices that these characters are making. Now, do you have plot elements? Of course you do, but they're a little bit more driven by the person reacting to the events, and their choices that they're making, and the people that they're surrounding themselves with, and their personalities. Those are really kind of the basis of what happens. So we're going to focus a little bit more, quite obviously, on plot-driven stories this week, because next week we're talking about characterization, and this week we're talking about plot. So when we talk about plot, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story, I have a little diagram for you to kind of lead us through that to start with. If I can pull it up and pull it over. There we go. Okay. Sorry for the technical delay there. Okay. So this is called Freytag's Pyramid. And the idea is that we are plotting out those plot points. We're showing the plot points in a diagram. So I'm going to go through the diagram. I'm sure some of you have seen something like this before. We'll go through the different parts, and then we'll talk about, as a writer, each different section. So the first thing here in the beginning is the exposition. You can see here that they have setting up of characters, the protagonist or the main characters, the antagonist, and then establishing the setting, the time and the place. Having the conflict, sometimes this is also called, if I can write with my mouse, an inciting, there we go, inciting incident. And this is essentially what sets off the action of the story. Sorry for the weird handwriting. It's the problem or the conflict or the issue or the twist of maybe someone's going through their normal day and something different happens. And then we have the rising action. So those are the major events that are leading up to the climax. There are twists and turns and the tension increases. And then we come to the climax. Sometimes people think of the climax as it says up here, what readers have been waiting for. Sometimes they think of it as the highest point of tension, and sometimes they think of it as the turning point. It really kind of depends how you think about the climax. It'll depend on where you place it in your story. Now here we have kind of a classic 3-act structure with Act 1 being the beginning, Act 2 being the middle, Act 3 being the end. You could also think of this as being a 5-act structure if you wanted, like a Shakespearean play, always 5 acts. Act 1 is setting things up, Act 2 is the rising action, Act 3 is the climax, Act 4 is the falling action, and Act 5 is the resolution. I know there's a lot now on this slide, so let me erase some of it. But essentially, you could have the climax right smack in the middle of your story, as it is seen here, or you could have it a little bit later on. Sometimes we see a pyramid that is shaped kind of like this, and it's skewed. Sometimes we have this and a lot of rising action, and then an open ending where the climax hits and there's not really any resolution. It really is up to you as an author. But at any rate, after we have the climax, that highest point of tension, there's a break in the tension. And the falling action, those major events in the stories, in the story, kind of decrease that tension and lead us toward this resolution. So the conflict is resolved, or the tension has been completely dissipated. I don't love that they have this lesson learned by the protagonist. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You don't have to have a lesson in your story. I think it's kind of it's not needed a lot of the time. But sometimes the protagonist will have learned a lesson. Sometimes they will have come to a deeper understanding. It depends what kind of a story you have. They also have in here the theme, which is defined incorrectly here. It's not a lesson or message. Message is different than theme, but we're going to talk about theme later on. I really don't want you to think about theme as much at this stage. I'd like you to think more about what's happening and who's it happening to and how they're reacting. So I'm going to move this back over, maybe. There we go. And let's talk about the exposition. So expositions can be very helpful. You can tell your reader, or show your reader rather, sorry. You want to show your reader, not tell. So you can have your reader discover something about the characters in the story. You can establish the setting of your story. This can work really well for certain types of books or certain types of short stories. So if you have, for example, if you're writing a science fiction piece or a fantasy novel or story, you might want to take a little bit of time to show your reader what that world looks like. What are some of the rules of that world? What is the what are the people or the vegetation or the topography? What do those all look like? So as an example, in my book Sutherland, it takes place in the 1800s. So I wanted to establish that setting, but really more importantly, to me at least, it's a kind of spooky, gothic book, and I wanted to establish the atmosphere. So I used the first chapter to have an incident that really nothing so much happens. It doesn't drive the plot, but it establishes the narrator. It establishes this family that she's going to be observing and then become part of. It establishes the atmosphere, and there are some period details in there that let you know what time period the story is taking place. So you can use exposition to do those things. Other times you want to, you may want to jump into the inciting incident. Most publishers that I know and most agents that I've seen, they're going to ask authors, if you're writing a book, to have the inciting incident within the first 5 to 10 pages. So that's partially because that's what you're submitting to them. So if you don't have that conflict that sets off the rest of your plot within a short time span, they might not be as willing to look at your work, because contemporary readers want things to move along. So really think about whether or not you need that exposition, or whether you can have an inciting incident and then slowly give some of those details about who these people are, where this is taking place. So I'll use myself as an example again. In my book Smothered, that book is a murder mystery. It's quite different from the historical fiction Sutherland. So, despite the fact that as I'm saying them now, they have similar names. So, Smothered, I start out with, there's an online tabloid that has gotten documents about this kidnapping and murder that took place 20 years before, 15 years or 20 years before. And they give you the facts of what the people knew at the time, and then say, hey, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be releasing these documents. So we're going to be giving you unheard of police interviews, unseen footage, that kind of thing. So in that book, I didn't, as a mystery, I didn't find it necessary to have a long exposition where I establish the detective and who she is and what her life is like, and then we find the body 2 chapters later. Some mysteries are written that way, and that's okay, but I didn't choose to do it that way. I really wanted the first chapter to set the plot off right away. So here's what happened. This child star was kidnapped, she was murdered, and let's get into it. So that's one of the things I'd like you to consider with, I'll drag this back over, with your, can I have half and half? There we go. With your exposition, do you need it? And if you have an exposition, is it serving a purpose? If it's serving a purpose to establish atmosphere or setting or the time or the place, to establish the background of a character, or to show what a character or 2 characters are doing, then definitely keep it in there. But you might want to also think about jumping into this inciting incident first, and then having some of that exposition kind of later on. You can reverse it if you want. So another example would be Law and Order is a good example of this. They have, if you watch that show, they find a body, or if it's SVU, there's some kind of an assault sometimes, within the first 3 minutes, and then dun dun, and then the song plays, and then we get into the background. Who was there? Why was the person there? How did this event occur? All of that kind of happens. It's interesting too to me that they always use the climax as a turning point to have a twist in the story. So you thought it was about to be resolved, and it's not. It's a very predictable plot line every time. Another example would be maybe if I erase this and we do 1 and then 2, if you read romances, or if you see a romantic comedy, does the meet cute happen in the first 3 minutes, or do we establish first why this girl is looking for love, or what happened to this guy, and who is he dating right now, and why does he need somebody better? And then maybe a little later on, they have a meet cute, or they have a conflict, or they meet each other and they don't like each other, right? All of that kind of thing might happen a little bit later on. So think about whether or not you need that exposition. Think about what purpose it's serving. And then you can think about your inciting incident, and making sure that it's something that is inciting, that it's going to be some kind of a twist that is going to carry your plot. As we move to the rising action, I have to drag it back over. Sorry, guys. Flip, 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 flip. Some of you are probably getting annoyed. The rising action comes after this inciting incident, and it's major events leading up to the climax. This could be tension between the protagonist and the antagonist. This could be a series of conflicts. It could be a series of twists and turns. The important thing here is to keep the reader's attention and to have consistencies in your plot so that if you have a twist, it makes sense. If you are like, what? How do I know if a twist makes sense? Does it come out of nowhere, like completely nowhere? Does it seem to be consistent with what the characters are deciding to do and how they're reacting to the situation? If you watch M. Night Shyamalan movies, some of them, they always have a twist, and some of them are better than others. Some of them are not that great because the twist is stupid. I forget now the name of the movie where the trees are attacking us. I forget the name of that movie. But the trees being the ones who are attacking people as opposed to it being like a bioweapon from another country. There's a lesson that he's trying to pound into people's heads, but it's not maybe the best twist in a story. The Sixth Sense, on the other hand, was done really masterfully well, and if you watch the costume choices and the way that things are shot and how the characters are reacting and the dialogue between the characters and the hints that are dropped, the twist makes sense even though some people didn't see it coming. So the rising action needs to hold that tension. And you can have little dips in the tension to kind of relieve people of things every so often. Sometimes that helps heighten the tension even more. If you read Shakespearean plays, he a lot of times has a tiny bit of humor to relieve the tension, which then makes a murder that happens later kind of even that much worse, right? And so that's something that you can learn from Shakespeare. But the idea is to have those scenes tied together to build that conflict. And we'll talk more about conflict later. Unfortunately, we can't talk about everything all at once. But if it's a person versus person conflict, are there misunderstandings that are not easily rectified? Are there hurts? Are there traumas? Do you bring in some of the backstory of the characters into it to add that tension and show the history of this conflict? If it's a person versus society conflict, how do they continue to struggle toward freedom or toward acceptance or toward self-actualization? How do they continue to struggle, and what are the different ways that society is beating them down? If it's a person versus self conflict, let's say you have someone who is addicted to something and they are trying to get sober and get clean, and then something happens and they're fired from their job, and then they go back, or they're tempted to go back to that substance, right? So there are a lot of different ways to build that tension and to keep that going. And a twist does not always mean something surprising. What I mean by that is that sometimes it's just something different happens that maybe the reader wasn't quite expecting. Maybe the person who you have that person and they are trying to get sober, and then you have something like they get a promotion instead of getting fired, but then that leads to more tension and a little bit more stress, and then they're tempted to slide back and use, right? So it's just those incidents that occur that are going to build that tension up until that highest point of tension, or your turning point, however you want to think of it. So now we talk about the climax. And I kind of mentioned this before. It really depends what kind of a story you're writing. Sometimes people like to build that tension up and then end on the highest note. Maybe You have a person who's been trying to get sober and they fall back and they die. And that's it. That's the end of the story, right? It ends right there. You have two people who have been squabbling and they fall in love and then they kiss, and that's the climax. The resolution is kind of implied there, right? The happily ever after doesn't necessarily need to be shown. So it's very similar to what I said about the exposition. You can really consider, do I need the falling action? How am I going to break the tension? Do I want to show what happens after the climax, or do I not want to show it? A lot of times in short stories, you'll really have from here to here. And there's a breaking of the tension, and that's it. So there's an inciting incident. We have rising action and tension along the way. The highest point of tension is reached, and that's it. One of the readings that I'm giving you for this week, if you're in my class, is The Monkey's Paw, and they're really, in terms of resolution, there isn't one so much there. But other times, if you have a longer work, if you have a book, you might want to show some of those things. You might want to show what happens after this highest point of tension, how things are resolved. You might want to leave your reader with things tied together a little bit more neatly. You can also, though, use this climax as that turning point and have the character come to a decision, a realization, a break in the conflict, and then show the rest of their journey. Or you could have a kind of a major twist in the middle, and then the tension kind of shifts from there. So how you want to structure it, it really is up to you, and it really does depend on your style and also what your characters are doing and how you've plotted things out. So as new writers, which most of you are, I think, if you're in my class watching this, you might not be. Maybe you're more seasoned and you're annoyed that I keep calling you a new writer. Sorry about that. But you can outline your plot, or you can kind of, if you want something a little bit more character driven in terms of how your action is going to take place, you don't really have to. You could kind of let your characters take things from there. But I think it's not always the worst thing to outline your plot. If you're thinking about what's my story going to be like, what's going to happen, particularly if you are writing a book, I think this can help quite a bit to have an outline, just because you're working with such a long piece of writing, that keeping things straight, sometimes an outline can help you from falling into having plot holes where you forget to talk about what happened with such and such a character. I have at some point a piece of writing from an author that I worked with where there's a character who comes in for one scene and kind of vaguely makes the protagonist a job offer and then is never seen again. And that's a major problem in terms of plot. What happened to that? Did the protagonist want the job? Did they want to take the job? Are we going to ever see that person again? Who are they? Why were they in that place at that time? So having an outline can help you to kind of avoid those types of situations. When I wrote my historical fiction novel that I was telling you about earlier, Sutherland, it was loosely based on or inspired by a true story of a family of circus performers. Now, they lived in the 1800s, and there are records of where they were at certain dates. So I really had to have an outline because I had to show, okay, we're going to have them at home and then they have this performance and then this fire happens and then they move on and they start traveling the country and then eventually they go to Europe. And I really wanted to make sure that some of those events happened in the chronological order that they occurred in. When I wrote Smothered, a lot of that book was making sure that I kept up that rising action and kept the tension because it is a murder mystery. So you want to keep people wondering who did it. So I kind of plotted out the days that this tabloid was releasing this information and what information they would be giving each week so that we had the kidnapping, the finding of the body of the victim, the first police interviews, the autopsy. Those all had to come at certain points because you can't have police interviews and then you find the body later. So it was a little bit easier to kind of outline and to plot out and things like that. When I wrote The Misadventures of Marvin Miller, I did not plot out the details of what happened. I had this kid who was making bad decisions and doing some crazy stuff to get girls to notice him. And I knew that there was another character who he was eventually going to ask out on a date. And I kind of let the characters take it from there. And eventually about halfway through, I was like, okay, so now I kind of know where this is going. I want to do this, this, and this, and then this will happen. But I didn't have like a full long outline. So you can plot out your outline if you want. If you think that it'll help you kind of keep on track, if you're writing something longer, definitely do it and kind of mark out these chapters are going to be the exposition, or I'm going to have the inciting incident first and then I'm going to have some exposition. Here's how I'm going to keep that tension rising and keep that conflict going. Here's where the turning point's going to be, or here's the highest point of action. Here's how I'm going to break that tension, and here's how I'm going to resolve the story and kind of tie things up and leave the reader with a good sense of satisfaction having enjoyed the journey that my characters were on. So that is it for today about plot. And in the next lecture, we will be talking about the readings for this week. And then in the following one, we'll be talking about the prompts and where you can take your imagination as you try to come up with some interesting and intriguing and action-driven or character-driven plots. That's it. Thanks, everybody.